Hello everybody and welcome back to Zethika Reviews World of Tanks. Now in this episode we're moving up a tier again from the AT2 last week with the Russian tier 6 heavy tank, the T-150. It is the heavier armored of the two tier 6 Russian heavy tanks, the other being the more mobile KV-85, and while it is true that this tank in general is better armored than the KV-85, the differences between the two lines are not yet as obvious as they will become in the higher tiers. The T-150 is a tank that in the right situations can use its high alpha damage and relatively good armor to bully its opponents into submission, but if its armor is outclassed, it has real trouble performing adequately. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. First, let's take a look at the key stats of the T-150, comparing it primarily with the KV-85 as it is its brother, and a general comparison to the other tier 6 heavy tanks. So, the first thing you're probably thinking about when talking about a heavy tank is the armor. And in this department, the T-150 sort of have what it takes and sort of doesn't. Its hull is 90mm on the front and sides and a low 75 on the rear. The turret is a higher 100mm on the front and sides, yet still the lower 75 on the rear. Looking at the raw stats by themselves, the T-150 is a bit heavier armored than its Russian brother, with a hull of 75mm on the front and 60 everywhere else, and a turret with 100 on the front and 90 everywhere else. However, as we all know, the raw stats rarely tell the full story. Looking at the two tanks' armor profile, we see that while the T-150 is undoubtedly heavier armored than the hull in nearly all scenarios, it also has two frontal weak spots that is as weak as the KV-85's armor, sitting around 60 to 80mm. On the turret, we find some other interesting aspects, in that while the two tanks on paper get the same armor thickness on the frontal turret, the T-150 has gotten the short end of the stick here. The KV-85's turret has frontally gotten large zones that is auto-bounce, and while it does have the three major weak spots that the T-150 have, to the right and left of the gun mantlet, right below the gun mantlet, and the cupola, the first two are smaller, harder to hit targets, and the cupola are more heavily armored. The T-150 does also have large parts of the frontal turret that are between 200 to 300mm thick. However, this hardly makes up for the much less effective armor and smaller auto-bounce zones, especially considering that 200mm, which is the highest it'll go on the sides of the frontal turret, is hardly adequate against even tier 7 tanks. Both turrets are rather weak from the sides and rear, and while there is a case to be made for the KV-85 having an easier time bouncing due to its rounded shape, this is hardly effective enough to warrant mentioning. So, what does all of this give you? In my mind, the T-150 is actually rather well armored. However, like its bigger brothers the KV-3 and the KV-4, its armor is rather dependent upon both your enemies not knowing what to do and not being higher tiers than you. If you start getting into tier 8 matches, your only real bet of using your armor is to try and get them to shoot your track/side armor while side scraping around some hard cover. Something that of course is a universally good idea. However, it falls flat on its face the moment the tier 8 tank decides to shoot your cupola, which is a measly 75mm thick. And the same will happen to it against tier 7, so if you can, side scrape around the right of whatever cover you're using, hopefully covering up the cupola. So it has a bit of the same issues that the AT2 and the AT line in general have. But I said that it is actually somewhat well armored, did I not? And this is because that, like the AT line, this is for many going to be one of the first heavy tanks they encounter. And if you're top or middle tier, your armor is actually quite good with a bit of goodwill and side scraping. What you should never do in this tank is count on your armor tanking the shots coming into you. You are not yet a KV-4 in a top tier match, rather you need at all times to try and hide your hull or at least the lower plate. And moves such as shots at the cupola or mantlet weak spots are difficult to pull off. It's also, like in the Mouse and the E100, a good idea to turn your turret away just a little bit away from the enemy. Not as much as you want in the Mouse and the E100 of course, since the T-150's turret structure would then flatten a large part of the armor, but just enough to cover up at least half of the mantlet weak spots with your gun, and making it a bit more awkward for those who know your tank's armor to determine where they need to hit. However, like playing those two legends, there is few things as satisfying as simply shrugging off shot after shot from an enemy who doesn't realize how to counter you, laughing your ass off as you see their gun desperately move across your tank looking for that weak spot, and pissing their pants when they realize you've covered it up. So, this time we're going to analyze this one-on-one fight between me and another T-150, and I want to highlight exactly why I statistically was much more likely to win from the start. Simply due to the fact of how our tanks are oriented and where we choose to fire on each other. So as we can see here, both of us are aiming at the tracks of the other. Now I can't say for certain what exact area he's aiming at, but I myself am aiming for the inner drive wheel and the frontal area of his side armor, and I would suggest from his gun angling that he is doing the same. Notice weak spots to the right and left of our guns, inside the gun mantlet. This is because there is only hole behind that area of the mantlet, and sadly, it is completely flat from straight on. However, the risk of aiming there is the very heavily armored areas found everywhere else on the mantlet, which is either very difficult or impossible to penetrate for a T-150, depending on where you hit. So you could argue the case that either of us should have gone for the gun mantlet instead. However, with our inaccurate guns, this is really not so viable even at this distance. Instead, what we go for is each other's tracks, and if we isolate the penetration chances for those areas, we can see why I'm saying that I already had won the moment he decided he was going to try and pen through there. Due to the difference in our angling, I have large areas of his tank that are ranging from 50-50 shots to 100% chance of penning him, and while he also has these chances, the areas where he are guaranteed to pen are much smaller, harder to hit when I move, and more easily hidden away should it be necessary. This is a textbook example of the difference between side scraping around a corner and moving front first around it. It's the same tank and the same gun, yet the chance for penetrating is vastly different. Most notably that he cannot penetrate through my tracks under any circumstances. And this is not even an optimal position. In reality, I'm not really side scraping right now, since he came in at an awkward angle to me and I can't use this house effectively. He has shots in on my lower plate and frontal hole in general. Under more optimal circumstances, he would have been denied this opportunity for good shots. Furthermore, what you'll see me doing is moving forward when I anticipate he's about to fire. This is because the further towards the back his shot hits, the less chance he does have of penetrating. And should he be aiming for my currently exposed front, it'll be much more likely that he'll hit the tracks instead if I move forward, simply tracking me but not having a chance of penetrating. And so, we come to the armament on the tank. The top gun on the T-150, which in my mind is the only really viable choice here, is the 107mm SIS-6, which with a 100% crew has got a whooping 300 alpha damage, quite high for a tier 6 heavy tank, with a rate of fire of around 6 per minute, giving it a reload speed of 9.7 and a DPM of 1840, which is admittedly not on the high end and 250 lower than the KV-85 with its 100mm gun, and with a penetration of 167mm, it is lower than the KV-85's 170, however, the difference in this case is negligible. It's also got an accuracy of 0.43 and a very high aim time of 3.26, against the KV-85's 0.36 and 2.6, making this one of the biggest fail pits for this tank. You can achieve a maximum of 7 degrees of gun depression, which is not so much, but it does still allow it some flexibility and is massive compared to the 3 on the KV-85. So, two things should have stood out to you from its gun. It is quite punchy and it is really inaccurate. If you're not careful with this gun, you will find yourself in situations where the enemy can stay relatively safe from your shots, since you are required to sit and twiddle your thumbs for 3 seconds before shooting every time you stop and shoot. This is also not a gun that allows for cheating the aim time to any meaningful degree, since the gun is simply too inaccurate to hit enemies with any certainty, without being near fully aimed. So where in other tanks you are able to ignore a little bit of the aiming time and fire with relative security, you are in this tank forced to sit and wait for at least the very most of it. However, it is also a gun that when hitting can give quite a scare to the enemies when they all of a sudden realize that all their health is gone, and the reload time is short enough that you can keep indecisive enemies on the back foot as you pound them down. Combined with the armor of the tank, we start getting a good sense of what environment this tank will do quite nicely in, and surprising absolutely nobody, it is cities or valleys, any place that allows an engagement in close to medium distance where it can either hide its weak spot completely or the engagement is so linear as to allow only frontal encounters. It will do quite nicely. However, woe be to you who drives a T-150 out into the open, thinking you are a heavily armored tank, and upon spotting an enemy decides it would be a good idea to sit with your thumb up your ass for 3 seconds, taking tons of damage in the process and most likely missing the shot with your wildly inaccurate gun. So, moving on to its mobility, its 700 horsepower engine gives it, without equipment, a specific power of 12.89, and with a top speed of 35, you will get there every so often. And funnily enough, the KV-85 is not significantly faster in either of those aspects. However, its track does have significantly better terrain resistance, so you will in most cases still see the KV-85 moving faster than the T-150. And when looking at both the turret and chassis traverse speeds, the T-150 is significantly slower with 25 and 18 degrees per second respectively, against the KV-85's 29 and 30. Now, this is a heavy tank, and it is on the line that is going to be the heavy Russian heavy tanks. So we do not expect great mobility from it. However, at this point in the tech tree, the difference between the two lines are actually not so very pronounced yet, and the T-150 is actually not that slow of a tank. Sure, it is no medium and you will find yourself left behind every so often, but it is certainly also no AT2, and you are definitely fast enough to get to where you need to be in a timely manner. It is also not so slow yet that you can't deal with circling lights simply from turning both your turret and the chassis at the same time, in most cases anyway. Yet it is also not mobile enough to allow you to keep your armor well anchored against multiple targets at once, rearranging yourself between their shots. It is, however, entirely decent when looking at it from a city tank perspective, where the hard ground allows it much more freedom of movement and less getting stuck in swamps. So, what is the end result for the T-150? Well, in my mind, the T-150 is a decent enough tank all around. It's got nothing extreme going for it or against it, besides that aiming time which you will feel again and again with frustration. It is also certainly well enough armored that it serves quite decently as an intro to how the higher tier tanks should be played for newer players, with the same sort of structure in the turret as the KV-4, and the importance of side scraping being highlighted. I must mention, however, that I find myself again and again getting surprisingly good results in this tank. Often I find it performing far above what I would think it should be able to, even putting it into hilariously outmatched situations. It sometimes can perform wonders, and quite often comes out better than what I would have expected. So in short, it's a tough nut to love with its high aim time and inaccurate gun, but once it's cracked, nothing but marshmallows and ice cream will come flowing out. Unless you are bottom tier, in which case nothing but farts will greet your eagerly awaiting nostrils. So, I hope you enjoyed my tank review of the T-150. If you have any tank you would like me to review next, give me a heads up in the comments and I'll get to it as shortly as possible, barring any tanks I have yet to unlock, in which case it'll have to wait till I reach them. Also, I've recently acquired myself a new microphone, which is very nice, so if you feel that some of the audio levels need tweaking, please say so down in the comments and I'll take care of it to the best of my ability. So, if you wish to see more in the future, don't forget to vote and subscribe, as this really does help out tremendously. And I certainly hope I'll see all of you back another day for more World of Tanks. Have a good evening!